Welcome to Leadership Nuggets. This week, we said goodbye to one of Singapore's greatest leaders, Lee Kuan Yew. And Lee Kuan Yew is a very controversial person because there's been a lot of things in what and how he's managed Singapore over the years. But I thought this week we'd pick 5 interesting positive lessons that we can learn from Lee Kuan Yew and positive leadership lessons that we can take home and apply directly. So here's my top 5 lessons I learned from Lee Kuan Yew. So my first leadership lesson is that leaders cry yet make very tough decisions. What does that mean? In 1961, Lee Kuan Yew was pushing really hard for an integration between Singapore, Sabah, Sarawak and Malaya to form a new union called Malaysia. And he succeeded ultimately in 1963 to form this union. Yet in 1965, because of the unhappiness of his people and because of issues that were cropping up in this merger or this marriage, Lee Kuan Yew had to make a very tough decision to pull out of the union. Actually, he was kicked out of the union by Malaysia. And when he got kicked out of the union, he cried. He bitterly cried. But yet, he then started to say, I still need to make some tough decisions to ensure the survival of Singapore. And that's what leaders do, right? They cry when bad things happen, but then they quickly resolve in their life to say, okay, it's a bad thing has happened. Let's now figure out how to make some good decisions to ensure that we still succeed. So that's leadership lesson number 1. Leaders cry, yet they make tough decisions. The second leadership lesson is that leaders listen. What do I mean by that? In the 70s and 80s, the people of Singapore were very upset because they did not have homes, they could not afford homes. And Lee Kuan Yew had always had his ears on the ground. He was always listening and he was always wondering, what's happening? And as he heard these murmurs, he resolved in himself that he was going to do something about it. So he started to take government land and started to build these things called HDB homes. And as he did that, more and more Singaporeans became able to afford homes. And in 2005, there was a study done. 90% of Singaporeans today have a home. So lesson number 2 is leaders listen. The third lesson I learned from Lee Kuan Yew is that Lee Kuan Yew never ever stood for mediocrity. He said it as it is. He never minced his word. He had certain beliefs, he had certain truths, he had certain things that he was very confident and sure of. And he stood his ground, regardless of it being unpopular, regardless of everybody around it saying this is controversial. He stood his ground and he continued executing. And a lot of his belief, if you look at it, right, how it translated. Today Singapore has one of the lowest crime rates in the world. It has some of the best education institutions. It has some of the best healthcare systems in the world. And a lot of it is because Lee Kuan Yew stood his ground and said, this is what we want to build, this is what we are going to do. And regardless of being unpopular, he stood his ground, he said it as it is, and he never minced his word. And this is why Singapore is where it is today. My fourth lesson is that leaders are very tenacious and very vision-focused. Now, what does that mean? In 1965, Singapore had a dilemma. On one side was Malaysia, the guys that they had kind of broken out of. And on the other side, they had Indonesia, this big, huge, humongous land with huge population that they were sandwiched in between. And both, Indonesia had this thing called the konfrontasi where they were fighting against the folks around. And at the side, there was some hostility with Malaysia. And yet, Singapore was this small village that had to survive in between. And Lee Kuan Yew, in spite of all this, didn't give up. And he said, look, I'm very vision-focused. I'm very focused on making Singapore great. So regardless of circumstances, regardless of the fact that we had no water, regardless of the fact that we had no resources, my vision is to make this a great Singapore. And he tenaciously executed one thing at a time to ensure that Singapore was successful. And that's what great leaders do, just like Lee Kuan Yew. They are very tenacious, but so tenacious, but they're tenacious towards that vision, the vision that they have to make that place or that organization that they're in a better place. The final lesson, my fifth lesson that I learned from Lee Kuan Yew is that leaders always have a succession plan. Leaders always build succession. And this was the case with Lee Kuan Yew and in Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew had always intended his son to continue the legacy that he had built. But in between, he enabled Mr. Goh to take over as Prime Minister before his son. But while his son was on the sidelines, he made sure his son experienced everything in Singapore, running different ministries, going overseas on different assignments, and ultimately experiencing what it is to be a great administrator and to enable him to become the great administrator after his son. And that's what great leaders do, right? They always have a plan in place for succession and for legacy. So these are the 5 lessons. Leaders cry, but they make tough decisions. Leaders listen, and they make good decisions based on what they listen to. Number 3, leaders never stand for mediocrity. They always say it as it is. They never mince their words. Number 4, leaders are tenacious and very vision focused. They have a very clear sight of their vision, and they tenaciously have an execution plan to get there. And finally, leaders always have a succession plan in place. So these are the lessons that I've taken away from Lee Kuan Yew. And in spite of all the controversies, at the end of the day, Lee Kuan Yew will probably be remembered by the people of Singapore as a great leader who took them from a village into a first world nation.